way in our lives, God. So receive this offering, God. I pray that it brings pleasure to your heart. Pray that it brings worship into the throne room, God, as we give to you this morning. So would you bless this tithe, all these tithes and offerings, and use them mightily for your kingdom, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. You can have a seat.
All right, guys. Thank you for joining us in our studio. I wanted to ask you a couple questions, and you can answer however you feels best. Are you guys ready? Okay, first question. Here I have what is called a Monopoly money. And this is a $5 one, a $20 one, and a $100 one. Who wants which one?
I want that one. I want this one.
Oh. Now, I also heard that you guys like candy. Is that true?
Yeah.
I have an M&M, okay? And I'm going to give you this many. Is that enough for you?
No. I want more. I want more too. I want a lot. Me too.
Okay, well, how about this? Now, is that enough for you guys?
Yeah.
Well, good morning. It's good to see all of you. If I haven't met you, I'm Justin Ristow. I'm the discipleship pastor here. I'm also known as the kid with no teeth, his dad. It's my son Christian, too. But it's fun to be with you guys here. Those of you who are outside, it's good to have you guys with us, and those at home, too. So this week, we're going to be continuing on in this series, which is all about financial health and really how do we grow in that. And it's one where I know when we talk about money, there's going to be a lot of emotion that comes with that. And so just to preface before we go anywhere, what I want to just say first is we've all made mistakes, right, when it comes to finances, how we've spent them, things we regret, things we wish we would do differently. And so I want to just start with that attitude of, hey, we got to have some grace for ourselves, for each other, knowing that, again, there's places we need to correct, we need to change, but also knowing there's places we can grow. And that's really my heart for me and for you, that I hope we take in the words today and be both encouraged and challenged by what they say. But before we get into that, I want to just open with a word of prayer and just especially lift up to the families of the two deputies who passed away recently, and then just all of our family that's connected to them through their colleagues, through people who knew them personally too. So let's just start with a word of prayer over that. Jesus, thank you for our time together, but we just begin by asking for your comfort, God. Thank you that you are a God of comfort. And God, for these two families that are just mourning the loss of husbands, sons, dads, for these two deputies, God, we just pray for your comfort to be there just in a special way for them. And God, we pray for those that are impacted, the coworkers and colleagues and neighbors and friends. God, so many that I know just have been shaken through this. And so I just ask that you would be just in the middle of all of those, in all those places with each of those people, God. And our hearts just go out there. And God, as we spend some time today talking about money, finances, God, I know that's a tough area. And so would you just help us? Would you help each of us have open hearts and minds? And God, would you bring encouragement where it's needed to keep going, keep doing what we're doing, and bring a conviction challenge where each of us may need it too. And so we just pray all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. So I don't know what you were like, but for me, when I was growing up, I was kind of one of those kids who always tried to take a lot of the kind of harder classes at school, do some of the honors, those ones. So, you can think if you weren't them, okay, he's one of those guys, okay. Yes, I was. But in high school, I remember taking a world history class. It was AP World History. And as you can imagine, when you're learning the history of the world, lots of dates, lots of names, lots of places, you're trying to keep all of this straight. So going in, I thought, all right, I'm going to do my best, try and get through this, and try and pass the test at the end of the year, because really that's the whole point is, pass the test so you get some credit, get out of some college classes. So I did that, went through, I got to the test at the end of the year, and I remember getting it, and you got two parts to it. You have multiple choice, so went through that. There were some questions. I'm like, I have no idea what this is, where this is. But hey, I got a chance, right? It's multiple choice. So, you take your best guess or draw a picture, whichever type you were. And then I get to the essay, and there's 2 questions. So the first one I hit, and I'm like, all right, I got this. This is no problem. Second one, I'm like, all right, I don't got this one. This is a problem. So I'm like, what should I do? And so I did probably what many of you have done, if you're honest, okay? You just kind of wing it, right? You're like, I know enough to throw some names, dates, and hey, we'll just see what happens. So that's what I did. Luckily, I guess I knew enough to pass, just barely. But I mention that because I think there's places in our life, whether it's school, maybe our careers, maybe when we're with certain friends, or even our spiritual lives, where we feel like, you know what, we're just kind of, faking it a little bit there. We know enough to kind of act like we have it together, or we know some of the lingo, but really it's like, no, we don't know this. We don't know what we're doing here. And I say that because when it comes to money, it's really more of kind of a black and white issue. Money's a test, is how I was thinking about it for today. And it's a test that we really can't fake. Because if I ask for some of your statements, some of your receipts, some of you would be like, okay, that's no problem. I don't care. Like, I'm pretty happy with how I'm spending my money. Others are like, no, don't put it up on the screen. Okay, I don't want it up there because it's obvious, right? How we spend our money reflects our priorities and our values. That at the end of the day, that's what it is. It may not be what we say are our priorities and values, but it reflects what they truly are. And that's just kind of reality. And I think the place that those values, those priorities are shaped most is in 2 places. One is in the voices that we listen to or that we obey, would be another way to put it, because listening sounds, like passive. Okay, I'm just taking it in. But really, it's you're doing something with it. If you think about the voices in our world today, you got culture, you got the people around you, you have your own wants, your own desires. Those are all things you can listen to when it comes to what to do with money, what to do with possessions. But also you have God's word to go, okay, am I going to listen to that or listen to all these other voices? The other place that we have to think about is what perspective am I going to take with money? And by that, I mean, like, what kind of time frame are you looking at? Because I think the longer the time frame, the better the choices you're going to make, right? I mean, you take a short time frame and you just think, okay, what sounds good today? But tomorrow, next week, a year from now, I might regret that decision. And so the more you can zoom out with your perspective, the better the choices you can make. And I think as Christians, if we can zoom out to kind of the eternal perspective, I think we're going to have the best choices. And so that's kind of where I want to start today. And we're going to start by looking at the book of Luke, chapter 12, verse 15. And for some of you, you're wondering what is under here, right? What's the big reveal? Well, you got to wait longer. Luke chapter 12 is where we're going to pick up to start with. So turn there. We're going to pick up in verse 15. It's a passage some of you are familiar with. But let me just give you kind of a little background. What we're going to look at is you got 2 brothers in this scene. And when it comes to brothers and they're not getting along, what do brothers do? They either fight or they bring someone in who's going to resolve this for them, right? So the one brother, he wants his inheritance. So he says, I know, I'll just bring Jesus in. And, he'll be the trump card to really make sure I get what I want here. So he tries to do that, but Jesus sees through it and realizes, no, there's something deeper going on in your heart and in your life when it comes to the place money and possessions have. And that's where he's going to begin. And so look at verse 15 at what it says. And this is Jesus speaking. He said to them, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. So it starts with this phrase, be on your guard. I mean, it's kind of the idea of watch out. I mean, if I told you watch out when you get home today, when you got home, you'd be like this, right? You're creeping around, seeing, okay, what's going to get me? Who's just going to jump out from behind the corner? Because you're on alert. You're paying attention. That's what Jesus says. Be on alert. Pay attention. Watch out. And what are you to watch out for? He says all covetousness or greed is another way to translate that idea. And when you think of greed, don't think of how much money it is, but really think about the heart condition. Because greed's something that can afflict someone with little money and with lots of money. Because it's all about getting what you can for yourself, for your enjoyment, for the here and for the now. That's really the desire that's in the heart of someone who has greed. And the reason why Jesus warns against this is because isn't it tough to notice it in the mirror? I mean, it's easy to look out and maybe we go, oh, that person, they drive this car, have that house, they're a greedy person. And we just want to define greed by like a dollar amount or by an item. But we would never say, sometimes I struggle with greed or with covetousness. I mean, that's something we just wouldn't say. And yet, I think we need to be cautious. Like Jesus says, we need to watch out, to pay attention, to look hard and see, does this exist in our lives? And so let's look at the parable in verse 16 where he begins this parable. He told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I'll do this. I'll tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. If you notice, there's nothing in here to say this guy's done anything illegal, immoral, anything like that. He's got a lot, and he goes, hey, I got more than I can store, so I'm just going to build something bigger so I can store even more. And the crazy thing is, if you look in here, you look at all the uses of I and my, there's 11 different times because his focus is on himself. What can he consume? What can he get? What can he gather? There's no mention of God or of others in his equation here. That he has a lot and he just wants to keep it and he wants to enjoy it in the here and in the now. And then Jesus continues in verse 20. But before he does, I want to say this. If we were to look at this farmer today, most of us would probably say, hey, that's a successful person with the way that it's being described. That's how we would look at them as kind of an American through our lens. They're a successful person. They've gotten the dream. They've gotten it all. They've gathered it together. And yet notice how Jesus responds in verse 20. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you've prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. So this guy is defined totally differently than what you would expect, what we would expect. He's called foolish because his whole focus is just on accumulation for his own sake. And he's reminded by God, okay, you're dead now. So now who's going to enjoy everything you've gathered, everything you've built up, everything that you have? Someone else. You're not going to take it with you. You're not going to be able to enjoy it here. And so it's a pretty stark contrast and a pretty, I think, a helpful one when we think about the world we live in today. Because I think as Americans, so much of this foolish farmer is kind of the common, average, everyday mindset that we see, that we want to focus on just today, the here and now, on gathering what we can, getting as much as we can, and we just want to focus on ourselves. We don't want to think about what part others or what part God might have in that mix. And so I start there because I think that gives us a framework. And now I'll let you see what this is. So what I want to give you is a little bit of a framework, and I want you to wrestle through this because the scriptures are clear on the principles we're to live by, but there's some flexibility in what are the exact amounts of this. And so what I want you to first think about is there's 4 uses we can have for money, 4 broad ones. You can use it to live off of. That's your lifestyle. That's your house, your clothes, entertainment, fun, all those different things. You can give some of that. You can grow it, which is like saving, investing, or you can owe because you owe taxes and you owe debts. Okay, and so those are kind of the 4 ways that we can use our money. And for this size room, I'm sure we have people who make all different incomes across the spectrum from, $50,000 to, $250,000 a year. All different ones. And so the point is not how much do you make, but really as you look at this, think of this as your income for the year. Whether it's 50, 100, 300,000, doesn't matter. And how are you using what you have, okay? And so I'll just take this. We'll say it's 100, just since it's a nice round number. And for the finance guys in the room, you like, because it's also an easy percentage. So we'll go with that too. So let me give you just a few averages, okay, for Americans, because I think this will also give you an idea of what this foolish farmer might have been like too. And so just to start with, let's start with what we owe, okay? So first off, we owe money to good old Uncle Sam, right? On 100, maybe you owe 20 or so, give or take. So let's put a little bit of that in, okay? So let's say that's, roughly 20, give or take. Now, for most people, in debt payments, like for student loans, car payments, credit cards, all those things, the average is you spend about $9,000 to $10,000 a year. That's kind of the average in just those payments. So let's put those payments that we owe in there too. And then, that brings us, 29, 30,000, something like that is what we owe, okay? So after that, most of us, we would kind of go next to, okay, what do we have to live off of? And so we'll take that, and that's kind of the bulk of our spending, if we're honest, is kind of all of our living expenses. So we'll put these in. I'm doing a lot better this service than last. Last, they were like all over the front row. So that's roughly, let's say 65,000 or so a year. We'll put a little bit more, just to call it a day. That's kind of all your living expenses, the things that, like I said, clothing, housing, all those types of things, 65,000 a year. And so after that, let's say as Americans, we're not great at saving, but we do, 5%. That's kind of the norm. So we'll put a little bit of that in too. All right. So somewhere around there, maybe a little less than that. We'll take a few of those out. All right. So maybe 5,000, roughly like that. And then, we got a little bit of room left. And so, maybe you see that puppy dog commercial on the screen with the sad music, or, there's something, just a disaster, something significant going on. You're going, all right, I want to give towards that. And so I got a little bit left. Let me just fill in the top here. That might take too long, so I'm just going to kind of make a mess. So you just put the rest on there, all right? You got your little bit of giving kind of at the top there. Maybe it's 1,000, maybe it's less than that, more than that, somewhere in that ballpark. So that gives you a little idea of, okay, how is the average American spending their money? On what they owe, what they're living on, what they're saving, and what they're giving. And I have this just so you have a little bit of a visual to think first of not where do I want my money to go, but where is it actually going right now? How does it kind of compare? And to think a little bit about, am I happy with that? Should I have more debt, less debt? Should I have more savings, less? Should I be spending as much of my lifestyle or less on it? But I think really the farmer that we read about, he probably has a similar picture to this because he's focused mainly on himself, primarily on himself and on today. And that's where most Americans are focused on too. And so I want to just start with that as kind of a picture. And I want to give you 5 principles to kind of wrestle with, think about, is how I spend my money being reflected through these 5 principles? Are these 5 principles coming out in how I'm spending my money? I guess would be a better way to say it. And so the first principle Greg talked about last week, and it's to spend less than you earn. Or he put it this way. He said, we need to be content with the fruit of our labor, and we need to define what's enough. And he said, you're at enough when you produce more than you consume. Or in other words, like I said, spend less than you earn. That's a place to start. A simple principle, but I know sometimes it's hard to do, where maybe you have more expenses than you have money, and you have to put some on a credit card, and you're spending more than you're earning for that month. And he also said, enough is when your needs are met, and that you also need a budget to decide where your money's going, not just to wonder where did it go, but to be intentional and directional about your money and to really be specific about it. And so that's the first one. I'm not going to spend much time there. If you weren't here, go back, listen to him talk about that. The second thing is we need to give generously. And I'm not going to get into that much either because Greg's going to talk about that next week. But really, one of the ways we acknowledge God owns it all and has given us all that we have is to give back a portion of what he's given to us. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 18, notice what Paul says. Speaking to all of us, really, would be in this group he's speaking to. They're to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. And really, generosity, giving generously is something that we should be about, and we should be seeking to grow in that area. One of the things, I don't know if Greg will say this, and if he does, I'll steal his thunder. But, sometimes we talk about retirement, and we want to pick a number. What am I aiming at? But have you ever thought about what's a number I'm aiming at for my generosity? Like over my lifetime, how much would I love to give to this ministry, to this particular cause, to this thing? I don't think that's something we think about too often, and yet we should be people who give generously, strive for that. So the last 3 points, that's where we're going to camp out today, though. The next one, principle 3, is we should avoid the use of debt. And so the scriptures are pretty clear on this. In Proverbs chapter 22, verse 7, says, the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is the slave to the lender. Now, first, when you read this, I want to point out one thing. It doesn't say debt is a sin. It doesn't say that first. What it does say is that when you go into debt, that what you're doing is you're obligating yourself to another person. You're giving them priority and control over some of your current and future spending over your life right now. Just like that slave and master kind of relationship, that same mindset where you're giving up some of your control there. And there's lots of places you can see this, but one of those that I know I've seen more than once, and maybe you have, is the person who they feel like God's calling them to go overseas and go tell people about Jesus where he's not known. And they think, I want to be trained and prepared to go overseas, and so I'm going to get a college education. I'm going to go get trained and equipped to do this. And so they head in, and first year, it's expensive, so they take out some student loans. The next year, they take out some more. The third, the fourth, they do that. They graduate, and they're excited. They're ready to go, ready to get on the mission field. And maybe they have $60,000, $80,000 in student loan debt. And then they find out, oh, I can't go. Most mission agencies won't let you get into the field with student loan debt. And so they have to decide, well, what am I going to do now? So most often they get a job, start working, try and start paying that debt. In many cases, though, they just give up on that dream and settle into the American life, to things as they are, and they never make it. They didn't realize that small decision along the way to go into debt, to accumulate that over these years, that it would hinder them in the future. For some of you, one of the ways that you've seen debt restrict you or hold you back is maybe you'd love to have a job closer to home because you have a long commute. Maybe you got to commute down to Orange County or maybe Escondido, San Diego, something like that. You have a long drive and you'd love to be closer to home, but it also would require maybe a pay cut, 10%, 20%. I don't know what it is for you in your industry. And you think, I could never do that because of the obligations I have the student loan payments, the credit cards, maybe the mortgage that I took out, and just the debts that I have, the obligations that I have, I can't take anything less. I don't have that margin, that wiggle room. And so you've seen firsthand how debt has restricted you. And that's, again, one of the reasons to avoid it. Now, you might wonder, okay, is it just the Old Testament that talks about debt? No, Paul continues, and he talks about this same thing in the New Testament. And so in Romans chapter 13, it says this: pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. And so you see Paul mentioning a few things here. He says, if you owe debt, pay it, pay it off. If you owe taxes, you should pay them. And really, at the end of the day, you should seek to not be in debt to anyone. The only debt that you should owe is a debt of love to one another, a debt that you can never fully repay as we seek to love one another like Christ loves us. And so the New Testament continues this same theme of avoiding debt. And in our culture today, let's be honest, this sounds crazy, right? Avoiding debt. It's so commonplace, so just normalized that we probably don't give a second glance usually. Our first question is, what's the payment on this? Can I be approved for this card, this loan, this whatever it is? It's not thinking about what's the full cost of this. And let me give you an example where you can see how this has changed. When cars first came out, people paid for them one way. Anybody know this? This is not a trick question. Yeah, they saved up some money, paid cash, okay? It's not a trick question. They just had to save, sometimes for years, so they had some money. But then in 1919, GM started a lending company, and they thought, hey, we could sell more cars if we made it easier to do that. And so they said, put 35% down and then pay off your car over a year, and you can get it. Which I know to us, you think, pay off a car over a year. That's crazy. Like, who could do that? And yeah, that was the normal thing back when they started with that. So that continued to grow year after year. In 1970, the average length was 34 months for a car loan, and the average amount was $100. Okay, you continue on 15 years later, 1985, the average is 51 months in length, and the payment is $270. You kind of go further ahead to last year, kind of the average that I saw is 70 months for the length of a loan and about $700 a month. Close to $700 is the average. I mean, off of that, what you would pay in interest over that time is $6,000 to $7,000. I mean, if I offered you $6,000 or $7,000, you probably have some good ideas how you'd want to spend that, right? And probably not first on your list would be, I want to give this to the bank. I mean, unless you want to make some interest. But you would think very differently. But because it's small, it's incremental, it's in the moment, we don't think about the full cost of this over time. I got one thing I put in the slides just for all the numbers people, the finance nerds, which I'm one of them. There's one chart, okay? There's only one. So the rest of you, you're welcome. I didn't put any of those in. I only put this one in. I did because it's so drastic. In the last 70 years, this is household debt, how it's grown in the last 70 years. And I'll just let it speak for itself. I mean, on the left, those are trillions of dollars, in case you're wondering. Trillions of dollars. I mean, it's astronomical how much debt has just become normal in our society where we don't even think about it. And that's why I think we need to really consider what God's word says. It says we need to avoid it because it'll restrict us. To go on a little bit further, we should avoid debt because it presumes the future. When we go into debt, what we're presuming is that we're going to make the same income or more. We're going to have the same health or more. We're going to want to spend our money in the same way in the future too. And we're presuming all these things will stay the same. But I think if nothing else from the last few years, COVID taught us none of us knows what's around the corner. None of us knows what we may face, the bumps in the road, the maybe cut and pay that we have to take, or if we have to relocate. We don't know that. And so we need to be cautious when it comes to the area of debt. I know with debt too, there's also the question of, is there good debt, bad debt? Should we definitely avoid some, but not so much on others? So just broadly speaking, the scriptures just say, we should avoid debt. And I would say we should minimize the time, the amount, any of that, so that the cost we have to pay is as small as possible or it's zero. We should avoid consumer debt for sure, because by definition, consumer debt's what you consume, and then it's gone. It doesn't create value over time. I mean, like in the car illustration, you buy a new car, and even if you paid cash for that car, in 5 years, 6 years, it's going to be worth, half to 2/3 what the cost was. So it's going down in value rather than up in value. So that's something just to consider. When it comes to student loans, mortgage debt, maybe business debt, it's a harder question you got to wrestle through is the value there? Is it going to help me earn more? Is it going to help me move forward? Is it going to gain value here? And like I said with student loans, sometimes you can take out so much, you can't do what you feel like you want to do. I know we had a friend who went through college and she wanted to do social work, but she knew I need to minimize my debt going through school. And so she paid for some of her school as she went and minimized the amount of loans that she had so that she could actually be a social worker, because she knew I'm not going to be making tons of money, but I want to do this because I'm passionate about it and I love doing this. And so she planned ahead to do that. And so I think, again, we need to be cautious when it comes to any of those things. We need to count the cost, not just in payments, but in interest is a big one. And really pray through, think about it. Should we be doing this? Third reason that we should avoid debt is the less you owe, the more you can grow. Really, the more you can free up money that you're paying in payments, that's money that you can shift, from down here to up here to increase, what you're saving, what you're able to use for other purposes, that you're not having to just give it to someone else. As I was working on notes for today, one thing struck me is time multiplies and magnifies how we approach debt and savings. And by that, what I mean is, with time, with debt, if we continue going into debt, doing payments, the average American spends $130,000 just in interest payments. So that's just interest over your lifetime you're paying. It's magnified. In the moment, you're like, it's $10 a month, it's $100 a month. It's not a big deal. But over your lifetime, that's magnified and it's multiplied. And the same is true when it comes to savings that we'll get into in just a minute. And so really where I want to leave you with is just really a challenge to restrict yourself now, or your debt's going to restrict you later. That this is easy to understand, I know, but it's hard to do it. If you decide, I'm going to stop going into debt today, and I'm going to start paying it off, that's a hard thing to do. It might take you a year, 2 years, 3 years to just go, I'm going to throw everything at this. I know when my wife and I would lead financial peace classes, I mean, the average was about 2 years for people to get out of debt. So you got to be committed to those principles, to living them out day after day, month after month, year after year. It's not easy. And I know even when my wife and I, we were paying off our student loans, it took us about 2 years. And I remember like being tired and like, I don't want to spend money on this anymore. But we knew, hey, there's a finish line. We're going to be done with this. And then we can put this money to better uses after that too. And so it's hard. But again, if you don't deal with it now, at some point down the road, you're going to have to deal with it because it's going to rob you of what you could save, of what you could maybe have in retirement. It can rob you of other things along the way that you would have wished you could do, but you can't because of those commitments that you have. So I think that's plenty on debt. Again, it's easy to talk about these principles, but it's hard. It's hard to work against them, hard to not give in to them. So fourth principle, save for the future. Scriptures are clear on this, that we need to prioritize saving over spending. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 21, verse 20, I love what it says, and I'm going to read it from the NIV because I love kind of the emotion, the imagery it captures. It says, "The wise store up choice food and olive oil, but fools gulp theirs down." I love that picture because I just think of, I have young kids, like I said. I had the one who's 6 on the screen. I have a 3-year-old, and you've been there if you've had young kids, and if you don't have young kids, if you have an animal, the same thing can happen. You turn your back, the food's there, and you turn back, and it's gone. You're like, where did it go? Did they even chew this, or did they just suck it down in one bite? I mean, that's the picture here that, again, the foolish man, same kind of imagery, same word that we just saw about the foolish farmer. This guy's described as being foolish, that he devours it, he gulps it down. But the wise store up choice food and olive oil. That the picture it's giving, choice food, it's kind of another term for grain. And so you'd collect grain during one time of year, olive oil in another year. And so it's giving the picture of year-round abundance, prosperity, that you're working all year round, but you're saving a little all year round as well. That it's something that you're doing continually, not just once in a while. In Proverbs chapter 13, verse 11, it says, "Wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it." And the whole idea with savings is go slow, but make it a regular habit, a regular thing that you do. Because if you think about it, we just had, I think it was a guy in Maine, right? Just got $1 billion with his Powerball or whatever that he won. The crazy thing is people who win the lottery, it's crazy the amount of them that go into bankruptcy. They have a huge amount of money, but they gained it so fast they weren't prepared. They weren't ready for it. And they either made bad investments, were conned, all kinds of things that end up happening. But those, like it says in this proverb, wealth gained hastily, quickly, it'll dwindle. But little by little, that's the point, to let it grow. Just an example of that. If you were to set aside, and let's say if you're 25 here, this is you, and if you're not, you can think back and go, I wish I would have done that. If you just set aside $5 a day at 25, when you're 65 years old, that $5 a day every day would have grown to roughly $500,000 to $750,000. Just from a simple habit of little by little, day after day, I'm going to do this. But you have time to compound it to create this snowball that's working in your favor. That's the whole principle that the book of Proverbs is describing here for us too. Proverbs 27:12 says this, "The prudent see danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer for it." And I mention this scripture because when it comes to savings, I always think of this because for any of us, we don't know what's going to be happening next year, the year after, and the next 10 years. But odds are you're going to have something significant happen in the next 10 years. Some emergency, something significant. Your water heater bursts and it leaks and you have a big flood at the house. Maybe your kid has an accident. You have a big medical bill you have to pay for. Maybe something happens to you and you can't work for a number of months, or you got to scale back and you got to work less. All these things can happen, and that's part of why we put money aside, is for the expected and unexpected things that happen. That it's not just dollars and cents when you get down to it, but it's in those moments knowing, okay, I have something to draw on. I don't have to go into debt for this. I have some money. And my wife and I know we saw the value of this years ago, about 10 years ago. We had been married almost 5 years at the time. And just totally out of the blue, my wife got diagnosed with an autoimmune disease called lupus. And because they didn't know she had it, hadn't had any symptoms before, got super sick, where she ended up being in the hospital for, I think it was 5 days, and was out of work for 2 months. I mean, nothing we expected, nothing we had thought, hey, this is going to happen. But we had made a decision a few years prior. I think it was the first time maybe we offered financial peace here at the church. We said, hey, let's go through it. And it gave us some principles, some of the how-to, the tools to get out of debt, to save some money, so that when that happened, we had money that we could draw on to help pay for those medical expenses. We could just focus on her getting better in the moment and not stress about the finance piece of things. But it was hard to get there. It took years to get there. But then in those moments, that's when you're grateful that you did the hard work to get there. So that's all I'll say on savings debt. Let me give you the last principle. And it's probably the most important one I think we need to remember, is that God owns it all and he provides it all. That I think if nothing else today, I think this principle will shift how you spend your money, how you make decisions about finances. Psalm 24:1 says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." And in the New Testament, one of the words that's given oftentimes is the word steward. That we're stewards. That psalm here is saying, hey, everything you have, you're a manager of, you're a steward of, you've been given. Later in, earlier in the Bible, in Deuteronomy, it reminds us too, God's the provider, he's the source. In Deuteronomy 8, it says, "You shall remember the Lord your God, for it's he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers, as it is this day." That it's God who gives you the ability, the skills to earn some income, to actually get money coming in. That he's the ultimate source, the ultimate provider for what we have. And so those two things I think are pretty important, because when you recognize them, I think it's going to give you a little less anxiety and worry, because you realize, you know what? God is the source. He'll provide for my needs. It may not be all that I want, but he'll provide for my needs, and he'll provide if those things are done and I have a new need, he'll provide for it. I can trust. I don't have to be fearful or worried about this. That I think it also makes us consider carefully how we're spending our money. I mean, if you work at a company and the boss who owns the company came to you and said, hey, I want you to go spend some money on this. And you're like, no, I'm not doing that. That's a bad idea. I mean, what's going to happen? You're like, all right, well, why don't you pack up your stuff? I'll get somebody else to spend the money the way I want it to be spent. It's his money. He's telling you what to do, and that's how it is with the Lord, that it's his. He's provided it, and he's called us to use it in a way that honors him and that's in line with him. The last thing I think, too, on being a steward is that we need to remember we're going to be rewarded or we're going to be reprimanded ultimately for how we use what we've been given. That, I mean, in that positive way, there's rewards that we read about in the scriptures, that you're going to be rewarded for using money the way God wants you to use it. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Greg will touch on this a little more next week too. But that's just something to keep in mind. We're going to be held accountable for that. So what I want you to consider, we've talked about these 5 principles. You can think about kind of where you stand, how your finances stack up. If it's like this, or let's say you decide, I want to make a change. Because like I said, the hardest thing is making the choice, I'm going to change, and now we got to do the hard work. Day after day, month after month, for the next year, the next 2 years, the next 10 years. And so let's say you decide you're going to do that, and you're going to reorder some of your priorities. And so first, my recommendation is make giving your first priority. Pick an amount. Don't just wait to see what's left. Decide beforehand, what are we going to give? And let's say you decide to do that, and you're going, I'm going to give 10%, let's say. Better keep an eye on how much I'm putting in here. All right, so let's say, you're doing that first, making that a priority. And then you say, you know what, I want to make sure savings is a priority. It's also not one of the last things as it was for the average American, but it's one of the first things. And you say, I want to do 10% for that too, to grow. And so you throw that in there as well. So that gives you roughly 20%, if you're the math people in the room. So that still leaves us a bunch of money to live off of. $60,000 roughly. So let's say you cut back slightly, a couple $100 a month. Maybe you cut back eating out, or maybe you cut some subscriptions you don't use as often. But you're like, we can make this work. We can cut back slightly, and it's not a big change. And so you're still having a similar, lifestyle to what you have before. And some of you I know will go, that is not correct percentages, but go with me. So that leaves, what you owe. And let's say you did the hard work and you pay off all your consumer debt. That's $10,000 right there that you've freed up for savings, for giving, just right there. And so what you have left is, what you owe Uncle Sam that you can't really get out of that. So, that's the last bit of the equation. I mean, as you can tell here, it's not a totally drastic, change. But the big difference is the priority of what you do. And the even bigger difference is the time. That time multiplies those decisions. I know we have, in our church, we have people, again, that make all different amounts of money. There's one family that's shared with me. They never made more than $70,000 their whole career. But for year after year, faithfully, they tried to apply these principles to their lives. And they mentioned 15 years ago, they stopped paying interest of any kind to anyone as a result of that. And they've been able to save up a little over $1 million in investments because of that. But more than the dollar amounts, it's given a margin with their time, with their generosity to be able to do things that they probably wouldn't have been able to do earlier. But because they did the hard work year after year, decade after decade, now they're reaping the benefits of enjoying the season they're in, the things that they have, the things that they're able to do. And they're free to pursue wherever God calls them, whatever he calls them to do. And so I mentioned, again, all this because we got to make a decision, and you got to wrestle through with the Lord. How am I going to spend my money? With what I owe, with what I want to grow, with what I'm going to give, and with what am I going to live on? And you got to wrestle through, what should you do with what he's given you? For some of you have a lot. For others, you have a little, but you still are going to have some accountability that comes with that, where you'll be rewarded or you'll be reprimanded for that. And so you and I have to wrestle with that. And that's why, again, I give this more as a visual for you to think about. And I'll just leave you with this is we got to wrestle with what voice we're going to listen to. Culture, people around us, it's loud. And it wants to get us to use our money, use our resources in a very different way than what the Lord does. And so we have to think about that. Are we going to prioritize now? Are we going to prioritize our wants, our desires, the things just for today? Or are we going to think about tomorrow down the road? Are we going to zoom out with our perspective? Think about eternity and how should I use what I've been given? Am I going to be rewarded as I think about how I use the finances, the possessions that I have? I think if we're going to use it God's way instead of the world's way, I think in the world's way, you always feel like you never have enough. But in God's way, when you start aligning your spending, how you're using your money with those principles that we talked about, I think you'll be in a place where you'll find contentment. You'll feel like, yes, there's more that would be great to have, but you know what? I'm content. I feel like I have enough. God's provided for me right now, and I'm okay with that, and I'm grateful for all that I have today. And that's really the place we want to get to, and I know in 2 weeks we're going to talk a little more about that. But what I want to leave you with today is maybe you're at that place and you're thinking, okay, I'm ready. Something has to change. Something has to shift. I know I didn't get into a bunch of details and diagrams and charts and all that, but the point of that was because really that's why we've offered as a free gift basically to everyone at the church that ability to go through Financial Peace, because that's a great tool that'll give you the how-tos of how do you do this? How do you get out of debt? How do you start saving? And that's why it's there. And I'm going to show you a video in a minute on that. But I just want to pray for you. Wherever you're at, whatever you're wrestling through, whatever you're thinking about right now in this area. Jesus, like we started, all of us have regrets with money, and all of us have places where we probably feel like we're doing a pretty good job. And yet, we need your voice louder than any other to speak into our lives and to shape what we do with what you've given us. God, we want to be good stewards, good managers of all that you've put in our hands. We want you to be proud of that. And so for each person here, would you help them to know what that looks like, what that next step might be? Or would you help them to do the hard work of applying that day after day, month after month, and year after year? And Jesus, thank you that you are so good and gracious to us. Thank you that more than money, more than possessions, that you give us yourself to be with us through each moment. And we're grateful for that. And we pray all this in your name. Amen.
My name's Eric Lazoya. This is my wife Amanda, and we've been at the church I've been at the church for 7 years, and then when we met, we've been at the church together for 5.5.
About
She
5
started
years.
to attend when we were dating. When we first encountered FPU, we each encountered it individually along the way. And I had gone to a number of different conferences and been a part of conferences where Dave Ramsey was speaking. And so I heard about it, I knew about it, I loosely followed it, but when we got married, about a year in, that's when we really jumped into doing the principles of FPU.
I think when we first started FPU, I was one of the skeptics that didn't think that we necessarily needed to do it because, as some of you probably know, my husband is a numbers guy and I'm not a numbers person. So when we got married, I was happy to let him take over and sort of lead us with our finances. But then when he broached the idea of doing FPU together, I thought, okay, sure. It was during COVID. The world was shut down a little bit. We started a group on Zoom, so we were able to connect with people. And I think for me, the way it impacted me the most was that it became ours. It wasn't just his anymore. It wasn't him taking care of the finances. It became our family's goal and our family's priority. We were pregnant at the time with our son, and so we were really able to look at our why and what our reason for working so hard and paying down our debt was, establishing what our why was, and looking at our son and recognizing that we have the power and the ability to change not only our life, but our son's life and his kid's life and for generations to come. It's just really powerful. And our little guy is a daily reminder of why we're doing what we're doing, why we need to stick with it. And so I think that impact has continued to just carry on from the time that we did FPU to now.
You know, the word says that stewardship is something that the Lord gives to us in every area of our life. But finances are kind of a key area over stewardship. And so if you want to learn how to steward your finances better, communication in your marriage better, I just would encourage you to get off the fence and jump into FPU. You've got nothing to lose, you have everything to gain. And so this is a course that is free through Olive Branch right now, and we just want to provide that as an opportunity for you and your family just to take that next step in your communication and the stewardship over your finances.